Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Barnyards and Backyards Live. I'm Jeff Edwards. I work for the University of Wyoming Extension. My co-host today is not Jeremiah. Abby Perry is my co-host today. Hello, Abby. How are you?
Hello, how are you?
Good to have you on board today. And always, Jenny Thompson is also considered a co-host. She's actually the runner of the program, I think, and keeps us on track, but you may or may not hear her voice. And our guest today is Vicki Hayman. She is a nutrition and food safety educator for the state of Wyoming and is in Weston County up in Newcastle. We're glad that you're with us today, Vicki. Welcome.
Thank you.
And so before we get started, for those of you who are either new or frequent users of Zoom, if you have questions for us, please just use your mouse and scroll over the screen and either use the Q&A box to type things in. I'll be monitoring that. Or the chat box. We'll be taking a look at that as well. If you are watching on Facebook, and Jenny, I'm not seeing that we're streaming to Facebook yet.
Yes, the control has disappeared.
It has disappeared. Okay. If you are watching on Facebook, please use the comment box if you have questions. We'll be monitoring that as well, and we can bring questions forward to Vicki. So with that, I think, Vicki, we're ready to go. So we are going to, we didn't talk about the topic today, but I think we're going to be talking about food preservation, freezing, canning, those types of things.
Hydrating.
Okay. So, oh, and dehydrating, yes. So please, I'm turning the floor over to you, and let's get going.
All right, am I up and running, Jeff?
Yes, you are.
Oh, super. Yeah, we're going to talk about safely preserving your garden harvest today. So I will take you through some slides, and hopefully you'll gain a lot of information, come up with a few questions for us. So here we go. First of all, let's talk about why we preserve food. I know I like to have fresh produce all year long, and I like the flavor of my produce that I've preserved. So it comes in handy, especially when I get home from work. Like most of us, we're working people. I love to have the food on hand. And I can also control sugar and salt in some of my recipes. And so if that's a dietary concern, then you have your own control over some of those recipes. And of course, I love the sense of satisfaction I get when I have jars in the pantry, or I may have food in my freezer. So there's many reasons why we preserve food. Now, the three main ways I'm going to talk about preserving food are freezing, dehydrating, and canning. Do you do any of those methods, Jeff?
Well, not by myself. I am my wife's assistant when it comes to food preservation. Abby, how about you?
I've done some, I do freezing, I think, more than anything. We do have a dehydrator that we got as a wedding gift that I've been thinking should be used more frequently than it is. But yeah, I do more freezing, I think.
Well, that's what I do. I like to freeze, but we're going to talk about doing it safely. And these are the main questions I get throughout the year, or especially during the produce time when people are ready to put up their food products. So let's talk about some of these safety measures for successful preserving. First of all, you need to have good equipment. Now, if you're going to can using a pressure canner, we recommend that you get that dial gauge tested yearly. If it's a weighted gauge, we can't test it. But if there's a dial gauge, then you want to get it tested. Most of the offices throughout Wyoming in our counties have a testing unit. You would have to call into your extension office and see if they have that service available, but it's free. It does not take very long. If you make sure we're in the office, a lot of times we can have that handled within probably 10 minutes or less. So
Vicki, we had somebody at our office bring in their gauge and we tested it for them and they took it home and then they did a little light cleaning of it, running it underwater, and wanted to know if they needed to have it tested again. Can you talk about that?
Yes, if it was underwater, I would test it again because I don't know if water got in to the cavity of the dial gauge. So as a safety measure, take it in, get it tested. If you accidentally ran it underwater or it accidentally dropped in the sink, things do happen. So better safe than sorry any day.
Okay, thank you.
The next safety thing we need to talk about is using research tested recipes that are published after 1994. So that is a big concern. I get a lot of people that call me and want to know if they can use an old recipe, and we really don't recommend it. There have been a number of changes in food preservation techniques, times, and these old recipes just are not up to date. So if
Vicki,
you have a yes,
sorry to interrupt. Old cookbooks are okay, but old canning techniques are not acceptable.
right.
Okay.
But the recipe may have changed, Jeff. So if you have an older recipe, maybe a family favorite, then I would recommend you look in the newer cookbooks for canning and find a recipe that's very similar, because it may have changed in the amount of ingredient in the recipe. It may have changed in the length of time it's processed, because as you know, with newer technologies and scientific methods of testing, things have changed. So if it's 1994 or older, don't use it.
Also, Vicki, can you explain how you test a pressure cooker? What is that process?
If you look at the picture in the slide, there's the lid is on a little unit. It reminds me of like a little pump when you're pumping up a ball, whether it was a basketball type unit. It's a long cylinder, and there's a little port, I guess, or vent, and you set that lid that she has right down on that. And then I have a little pump, you can't see it, and I press the pump like you would to air up a basketball or a ball. And then I look at the gauge on the upper corner, you'll see it up there, and I compare what the lid says with what my dial says at the very top there. So you see the two dials. I usually ask someone to help me because I'll keep an eye on the master, for example, dial, and we test at 5, 10, and 15 pounds of pressure. Now, we normally don't can anything in Wyoming at 5 pounds of pressure. So definitely 10 and 15. I do it twice because I want to make sure that the canner pressure dial is accurate. And Jeff, if it's over 2 pounds difference, we're going to ask that they replace the dial gauge. That's for safety.
The canner might still be good, but they can replace the pressure gauge or the dial.
Yes.
Okay.
The pressure canner dial can be changed out. I've seen people that have picked up canners at garage sales, and the canner's probably 50 years old, but the dial no longer works. So they just go buy a new one from their hardware store or wherever they find one, attach it. And even when it's new, we recommend that they come in and get it tested, because you don't know if it's been dropped during shipping, if it's stuck, or anything like that. So get it tested before you start.
Okay.
The other thing we recommend for successful preserving is following the guidelines for preparation. You want to use the correct jar size, the proper preservation method, in which we'll talk about in a little bit, and the processing time. I see all kinds of people processing salsa in quart jars, and it is not recommended through extension, the USDA, to use a quart jar, only a pint. So I'm always a little leery when I go places and they've processed in a larger jar, because you've got to get that heat penetrated through to kill any botulism spores or other organisms that may be growing or could be in that jar. So it's not a time, again, to be creative. You don't want to alter your recipes. So there are some changes you can make, and as we get through the presentation, I'll address a few of those. Now, these are the books we recommend. So sometimes you can check them out from your local library. Some of us have them in our extension offices. We'll loan them, check them out. It just depends on how much you can and what you're interested in and how much you want to invest. But the Ball Blue books or the Ball canning books are wonderful, and they have numerous ones out there and available. You just, again, want to make sure you're using an updated Ball Blue book, not one that Grandma had in her cabinet years ago. So check the date on the inside. The Complete Guide to Home Canning, which is this one right here, is another wonderful book. That's a resource we use all the time. The third one is So Easy to Preserve. And also, Wyoming Extension has Preserving Food in Wyoming. This book has fruits and vegetables in it. We do have a handout if you're interested in doing meat. So these are all safe, recommended resources for your canning needs. And they might have recipes on dehydration or also on freezing. Now, if you're wanting to use the website, we recommend Ball. They have a website called Fresh Preserving, and they have numerous recipes that are available there. They're not every recipe that they publish in their other cookbooks. Again, you can go to the National Center of Home Food Preservation, and you'll find the Complete Guide to Home Canning on their website. It's free. You can download the recipe or the section you're interested in. And of course, we have a variety of handouts on the University of Wyoming Extension Nutrition and Food Safety website. So shall we talk about freezing produce now?
Perfect.
Many foods can be frozen. And like I tell people, you can freeze anything, but you may not like the texture of it once you thaw it and use it. So that's something you might want to experiment with. Certain things like cabbage, celery, they have a lot of water. Cucumbers, they're not good for freezing, Jeff. So Abby, I don't know if you've tried to freeze any of these foods, but you'll end up with just a mushy product. Now, some of the foods you can freeze might be like a freezer slaw if you find a specific recipe designed for that, which uses maybe coleslaw or has a little bit of cucumber in it. So, you know, just look around, see what recipes are out there. And the one thing about looking around, and I didn't mention Abby and Jeff, is that the internet is full of recipes, but they're not always USDA approved and tested. So please be careful.
Had a few run-ins with freezing with foods that need to be blanched first. That's always a fun surprise when you get it out of the freezer and realize that you didn't prepare it correctly. So
This doesn't look like what I think it should.
Right. Exactly.
And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. I'll talk about blanching, if you're okay, in just a moment.
Sure.
We also have quantity, and that's one thing I like. If you have a small family, there's just 2 of you, you can freeze in a smaller amounts. If you have a large family, then you can freeze in bigger quantities, and that's wonderful. Plus, to me, foods that are frozen have great flavor, their color, they're more natural as far as the original product, in my opinion. So this is my favorite way of putting up produce. Now, we'll talk about some of the disadvantages and remind me to get to the blanching in a minute. If you don't have a large freezer, that's a disadvantage. I have a large upright that I use. I have a chest freezer here at the office. So, you know, that initial investment of cost in a freezer could be expensive, but see what your needs are. Now we're going to talk a little bit right here about the blanching process. You blanch foods, Abby, because it slows those enzymes down for food deterioration. So for example, in the upper picture, you'll see blanching. Now blanching can take 10 seconds. It can take up to 11 minutes. It really depends on what the food is.
So what is blanching, Vicki?
Blanching is when you take the food and you put it in hot water, boiling water, and that kills all the enzymes and the microbes that may be on the food. Now, if you don't do that, then your food might, as you see in the bottom, it might brown, you know, it might get, you know, because it doesn't stop. It just slows the chemical reactions in what's going on in the product. So if the recipe calls for blanching and freezing, I really recommend you blanch. You're going to dip it into that hot boiling water for whatever time allotment it says, whether it's seconds to minutes. Then you're going to put the food in an ice water bath to prevent it from cooking any further, because basically you're just killing those enzymes. You don't want to cook the food because that'll happen at a later time.
So Vicki, just curiosity here. If you don't blanch things and you go to take them out of the freezer, they still might be edible, but is it true that the nutrition quality has probably degraded?
It probably has, because it, like I said, the enzyme activity is just going to slow in the freezer. It's not going to stop it. So if you haven't stopped it with the blanching, you know, and it just depends on what the food is, Jeff,
Sure.
Whether, you know, you're working with potatoes, or, which you're probably not freezing potatoes because they kind of turn black, but, you know, maybe it's carrots or whatever.
Sure.
So it just depends on what the food is. Now with fruits, they don't blanch fruits usually. You might blanch them if you're removing the skin, such as peaches, like I see behind you. You've got some very pretty peaches. Now you might want to blanch it, and that just helps remove the peel. But you're going to treat them with some type of an agent to prevent that browning. So some people use ascorbic acid. Some get a citric acid powder that you can find commercially prepared on the shelves, or maybe even lemon juice. Because you want your product to look very pretty in the jars or in the freezer, however you're freezing it. Because some people use plastic containers, some use plastic bags, some use jars. Just make sure that whatever you're using is made for the freezer. And you want to choose high quality produce, so this isn't the time to put up overripe fruit. You know, it's not going to get better in the freezer. And one tip that we recommend is that if you're going to start freezing and you're going to put numerous foods in that are not frozen, then turn that freezer down to 10 degrees below zero to get it really cold. You just have to follow those procedures and make sure that you don't overpack that freezer, because then you're going to warm up the whole freezing unit. So, and another thing that's really important with frozen foods is to keep the air out. Air causes freezer burn. So if you guys get freezer burn, it's because there's too much air in the package. So some people like to use, Jeff, I think you talked one time about using those vacuum sealers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yep.
Those are great. If you have a vacuum sealer, yeah, get it out and use it, because that really pulls the air out of the package. They recommend you spread your packages out before you stack them up. So again, headspace is a consideration. Now in a freezer, a lot of times I recommend about a ½ inch of headspace because that food has water in it and it expands. So you need room for the expansion. And the other most important thing is to label what you put in the freezer. You get several red packages. You don't know if you've got sauce, you have just tomatoes that are crushed, or maybe even a chili sauce. So label them, put the date on and the amount. We always recommend first in, first out. So if you have foods in your freezer from last summer, get those out, use them up before the foods you put in from this summer.
So I'm not going to call her out by name, but she is participating today. There is an individual who is watching who has had some surprises when she goes to the freezer to pull something out because it's not labeled.
Oh yes, you know, I understand. You might have mashed carrots, or you might have mashed butternut squash. You know, you just don't know, or pumpkin. They look a lot alike. You might think that you're thawing out chili, and that's not what you have. So, yeah, do put the name down.
We do a lot of meat processing and do labels, and actually have found some labels that like to actually write a label and stick it on your meat, or stick it on the package, and they are like cold proof. So sometimes labels or tape will peel up, and these don't. So there are labels out there that are like freezer safe, if that's such a way to call it. But yes, they're really handy.
Right. I tend to just take a black Sharpie marker, permanent ink, and just write on my baggie if it's a baggie, because I've had labels that have peeled off and then it's a mystery of what's in my bag.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a surprise.
It is.
Raspberries on spaghetti. It's just not the same.
Thanks, Jenny.
Also, if you're using freezer containers, make sure they're for the freezer, because I've thrown in some less expensive plastic containers and they will break and they'll crack, and then you don't notice it maybe right away, but you can make a mess in your refrigerator when you're thawing food later on. So it's worth the investment. I think we'll talk about drying produce. Have you guys experienced any drying? Abby, you said you have a dehydrator.
Yes, we got a dehydrator several years ago as a wedding gift, and I've been looking at all this bagged frozen fruit I have, and I've been thinking about making some fruit leathers with it, but I have not done it yet, so I'm anxious to hear this portion of your talk.
Well, we'll cover a few basic things that I think will put you at ease for your food dehydration experience. Again, many foods can be dehydrated. And what's nice is they don't take up a lot of space. They don't take up freezer space. They take up less space in the pantry. My problem is I do all that work and there's only a handful of food, though, when I've got done and pulled it out of the dehydrator. So sometimes I'm a little surprised at how much it'll shrink up and what I really end up with. But I really like the flavor and the nutritional quality of it, and it's simple. Now, I recommend using a dehydrator, the oven, the microwave for a few things, maybe some herbs, and then air. You can air dry some herbs. I'm not going to talk much about using the sun. It's just difficult to control a lot of the environmental issues, whether it's sunny, hot enough, bugs. So that's not my favorite way to do things. So I won't even really address that today, if that's okay with you. But there is some initial investment if you purchase a dehydrator. Otherwise, your oven will work, but there's some advantages and disadvantages there, and I'll talk about that a little bit also. Sometimes the food is darker. Sometimes we over dehydrate and it's brittle. But practice makes perfect. And, you know, as you get used to doing this, Abby, you'll find that you'll make notes on your recipe and you'll know exactly how long to dry it and what it should look like.
So go ahead, Jeff.
Sorry, Vicki, most of what I think of when we are dehydrating food or seeing dehydrated food are these food packets that you can find in sporting goods stores for taking with you when you're backpacking or camping or those types of things. Can individuals dehydrate your own meals and preserve them? And sorry,
I'm not sure about a meal.
okay.
But you can do fruits and vegetables. You can do some nuts. You can do some herbs. You might need a freeze dryer, Jeff, if you're going to do a meal.
Okay.
I have not dehydrated a meal per se, just individual foods.
I'll look into that.
Yeah. So I really am not sure, Jeff. That's a good thing. We'll research that. The other disadvantage about drying food is how long it takes. I mean, it's easy once you get it in the oven or dehydrator, but it takes hours. So you have to have some time at home.
I think that our dehydrator we got, someone thinking that we could use it for doing like jerky and sausages, but my husband found that it was difficult to get the dehydrator to a temperature that was safe for making those meats. So is that a common problem with dehydrators?
It is. It is. There's two major types of dehydrators. There's one with a horizontal airflow and one with a vertical. And the horizontals, if you're out looking to buy a dehydrator, is what I would go with because it reduces flavor mixing of the foods between the trays. It's a more equal heat distribution. The vertical one is the fan. If the fan's usually on the base or the lid, top or bottom. And so those have a more uneven heat distribution. So you can find some inexpensive dehydrators, but you get what you pay for, in my opinion. So, for example, if you want to do jerky, I recommend like the Excalibur or the Garden Master are just a couple. I'm not promoting brands. This is for educational purposes only. But for jerky, you need to make sure that you have a temperature control. And so you want to look for like maybe 85 degrees up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Because if you're dehydrating, say, herbs, seeds, 100 degrees Fahrenheit is probably what the recipe will recommend. Fruits and vegetables, you need to dehydrate at about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And for meat or fish, you want 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So there again, you get what you pay for. So you want to make sure you have that temperature control go high enough if you're doing meats.
Okay.
The oven will take twice as long as a dehydrator unless you've got a convection oven. Now, I haven't purchased an oven for a while, but mine is convection. And so that fan blows and the air circulates to get a more even dryness. So if you have that, like to dehydrate and your oven has that option, you don't have to buy a special dehydrator. But just remember, it might take longer. And then again, follow that recipe for the proper temp and time, because if you dry it too fast, the outside is crusty, hard, but the inside has too much moisture, so then you get the molding. You need uniform size pieces. There again, it takes a little bit longer than just throwing it in the freezer to make sure your banana slices are even thickness and size. And then you will need to test for dryness. So if you're doing fruits and vegetables, you want them soft and pliable, but you don't want them sticky, tacky. There's too much moisture then. For vegetables, you're going to dehydrate them a lot more. So they're going to be a little brittle, crisp. So vegetables retain about 10% moisture. I think fruits are around 20%, if I recall properly. So you've got to learn through a little bit of practice at what level of dryness you need. But it's easy. So if you find that your fruit, for example, is still a little too tacky, you just put it in and dry it some more. So maybe you did banana slices 2 days ago, but you find that they're still a little bit moist. Go ahead and throw them back in your dehydrator and dry them out a little bit more.
We attempted to dehydrate strawberries, and I think we cooked them just a little bit too long because they were more like flakes.
Oh, oh no.
And that's where it's hard, because you don't know how thick people are cutting their fruits and vegetables. So make notes. Keep it on your recipe that, you sliced them a 1/4 inch thick and it took approximately so long to dehydrate. So always check your fruit earlier than what possibly the recipe says. It's just like baking a cake. It might say 30 to 40 minutes. Check it at 25.
Sure.
Because depending on where you're at and what the conditions are, it may be ready earlier than you think.
Well, we didn't try to repeat it. Diane was so disappointed in the outcome, she wouldn't allow me to do it again.
Oh, so good though on cereal. And I love to snack on strawberries. Well, do you have any other questions on drying tips? Okay, let's go on to talk about canning produce. So this is the one area I probably get the most questions on, is canning. Now, there are advantages to canning, and one thing I love is having the food on hand. It's in my pantry, and it can be stored for quite a while. So we recommend you use it within that first year for the best quality. It's not a food safety issue, but it is quality if you let it go up to 3 years. Don't call me and ask me if you can something that's 10 years old, because I'm going to tell you it's not worth the price of going to the emergency room. So if you find old canned goods, if you're cleaning out grandma's house, or, it just got back at the, put back in the pantry and it was missed, it's just not worth it. So try to use up your canned goods within 3 years. And then it can be economical. So I know Jeff grows a garden. I know we just try to grow tomatoes. With our work, I don't have enough time to put up a lot of fruits and vegetables right now. So I even sometimes purchase at a farmer's market or from somebody who grows a large garden. So those are tips. Do you grow a garden, Abby?
I do grow a garden. I tend to, kind of for the same reasons with job and work, I have a lot of perennial things like rhubarb and raspberries and strawberries, asparagus, but as far as tending to the other parts of a garden, I do not. And we've been snacking on we do a lot of snacking throughout the season on those things, so there's not a whole lot left at the end of the season to put up.
Well, that's good. You're not making too large of a garden.
Right.
I know some people, they call me and they're canning all hours of the day and night because the produce is ready, and so they need to get it done. The one main important thing is you've got to be knowledgeable about the process with canning. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute. There is some investment in the cost of the initial equipment. It can be time consuming. It's not as time consuming as dehydration, but it takes more time than freezing. And then improper methods are dangerous because, again, we talked a little bit about botulism, and you've got to kill those spores. And of course, a sealed jar does not mean a safe product. I've seen sealed jars that might have mold growing in them. Maybe they've been opened up, they have an off flavor, an off color. So don't be fooled that just because it's sealed, it's safe. Now, there are two main ways of canning, and the two main ways are the boiling water canning, and you use that with high acid food. So those are mainly your fruits and pickles and salsa. And if you're pressure canning, then you want to do more like your meats and vegetables. So a lot of people that are brand new to canning start out with the water canning method. I have some people that call, they never have pressure canned, and that's okay if that's makes you nervous. But there again, if you follow the procedures, it's very simple, easy process. So the pH of the food is what determines which method you use. And again, high acid foods such as fruits, pickles, and salsas are done in the water bath. If you're doing low acid foods, meats, vegetables, soups, or some kind of a combination type item, you need to pressure can. Do either of you have experience with those types of canning?
We used to do a lot of pressure canning with wild game meat, my husband and I, and really enjoyed how it tasted and how easy it was to just, come home and put a meal together with it. But now where we're living, we don't have a dishwasher anymore, and it seems like that cleaning the jars isn't as enjoyable as it used to be, and so we haven't been doing as much pressure canning as we have in years past.
We make a lot of jams using that water bath, which is a real easy thing for people to try if they want to get started in canning, it seems.
Yeah.
It is.
Sorry,
It makes
Vicki.
wonderful gifts.
I'm sorry.
The jelly makes wonderful gifts, the preserves.
Oh,
So
yeah.
as the holidays are coming up, plan ahead. Getting a gift basket with some properly preserved foods is a lot of fun.
That's what we're doing for Christmas.
Yeah.
We do a lot of water bath preservation too, jams and jellies and fruit and those types of things.
Yep. So again, the main thing is you got to plan ahead because it takes some time to prep the food, to put it in the jars, to put it in the canning, whether it's the water canning or the pressure canning. Follow that research-based recipe. And if you follow the steps, step by step, it's easy. And if you have questions, call us. We're in the extension office. There's 3 of us. We'll talk about who you can reach out to towards the end of my presentation. But we're more than happy to answer any questions from anyone around the state. Just give us a call. We do recommend you preserve your food as soon as possible. So if you pick your green beans, don't wait a week to preserve them. Get them done right away. Again, garden produce needs to be washed, because it grows in the ground. And this is my biggest concern is in Wyoming, everywhere, we have to adjust for altitude. We don't have any sea level places in Wyoming. So if you're adjusting for altitude, you're going to increase the time if you water bath. So instead of 10 minutes, it could be up to 20 minutes. And it depends on your elevation. So you need to know your elevation. With pressure canning, you're going to increase the pressure. Now, again, if you're confused on how to figure this out, give any of us a call. We'll help you with that. But there are charts in most of the food preservation booklets that will give you that information. And lastly, you want to test for a seal, because if you preserve your food and find we had a lot of questions. A lot of our people were canning. Now, when we can, we recommend using a ring and a flat lid and a jar that is made for canning. So don't use one-time jars. But we found that a lot of the lids were not sealing. And so we just figured something with the manufacturing had to have changed when they were putting the sealant on the lids. The lids can only be used one time. You cannot reuse those. The rings you can reuse. The jars can be reused. So again, test for that seal, because if it doesn't seal, you have a couple options. You can either reprocess it, you can eat it right away, or you can put it into the freezer. Have any of you experienced lids that didn't seal?
No.
Well, that's
I
good.
don't think so.
And now what we're finding is that it used to be you had to simmer the flat lids in water, but now the manufacturers have changed the component of the sealing compound, and a lot of them say you do not need to do that. So that's wonderful. Another question.
Vicki, would that information be on the box of the lids if they need to be boiled in water or not?
Right.
Okay.
So follow the manufacturer's instructions. We recommend you get new lids, like, you know, to use lids that are maybe you found somewhere stored in your basement that are several years old. You're putting a lot of product in. It's worth the price to go get new lids and know what you're working with. It's the same with using pectins when you're canning. You want to use fresh product, not something you've had stored in your pantry for years. So I know a lot of people don't like waste, but if you can all that product and it doesn't seal or turn out, then that's even more waste. So you kind of got to weigh your pros and cons. So what experiences, are there any questions, I guess, with the main thing, like I say, is you really got to watch your altitude, follow that recipe precisely so that you're getting a really good quality product. You want to kill the botulism that's, you know, maybe in the jar. But canning's a lot of fun. If you're just starting out, I recommend water bath canning. I also recommend find a friend who has experience. It's more fun to can with a partner.
Vicki, pressure canning can be a little bit intimidating just because of it's under pressure, right? So are there things, or is there advice that you have for folks who would be new to pressure canning that might alleviate some of that tension that they might have around pressure canning?
Well, the main thing is to follow, you know, the directions important, to follow them step by step. So for example, you're going to bring your water up to a boil once you put your lid on. You have to let the steam come out of that canner for 10 minutes before you put on the weighted gauge or the weight to build the pressure. Once the pressure gets to, let's say 12 pounds is what I'm going to, with my altitude, I'm going to use 12 pounds here. Then I've got to wait till the dial gets up to the 12 pounds. If it's a weighted gauge, you're probably going to use 15 pounds in Wyoming. So it'll rock or jiggle. It makes this kind of ch-ch-ch-ch. And again, if you're not familiar with that sound or whatnot, it might be a little intimidating, but you'll get the feel of it. Another big thing is you start timing once it gets up to pressure, not before. And then once you've pressured for, let's say we did meat for 90 minutes. Abby talked about doing game meat. Then you're going to pull it off the heat and you have to let it cool down naturally. So you're not going to run it under cold water to speed that process up, because with the recipes, all of that is taken into consideration, how long it takes to build up the pressure, the cooling process. All of that helps kill any organisms within the can to prevent you from getting sick. So just follow those steps, step by step. Again, I really recommend you start with maybe a small batch, do a, you know, maybe put up green beans and do that. You know, don't get overzealous and want to do 10 things at one time. You know, start out slow, and I think you'll really enjoy it. It's not scary. They have so many safety measures now.
Okay.
The newer canners also take a little bit less time than the older canners because of the material the canner's made out of. So,
Vicki, we have a question from Amy, and she asks, can you pressure can in an instant pot?
no. I see the directions say that you can in the Instant Pot or the instant pressure cookers, I'm going to call them. A pressure cooker is not a canner. And even though it says you can, we do not have enough research on that, so we do not promote it.
Okay. Sorry, Amy.
Yeah. You know, and sometimes the extension office, like I say, will check out some equipment. So if you want to try pressure canning, borrow one from a friend or check one out if you can at your local extension office and give it a try.
I was going to mention that it's super helpful to have a friend or a relative that's already been doing it for quite a while and to do it with them to kind of mentor. They can mentor you a little bit and then you get more comfortable with it to do it on your own.
I think that's how we started canning meat is had an aunt who canned it. And so, yep.
Well, I learned with my grandma, but some of those procedures have changed. They used to do what they called open kettle canning of jams, in which you would not water process the jam or jelly after you put it in the jars, and that's no longer recommended. So don't take your jelly jar, turn it upside down, and not heat process it because you could make someone sick. So, and some people want to preserve in the oven, and there's all kinds of wacky ways out there, but they're just not approved.
Perfect. What else do you have, Vicki? Are we?
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about jerky? Are you guys all right with that? I know I get a few questions on jerky, and the University of Wyoming has 3 methods they recommend. And I know Backyards and Barnyards put out a wonderful publication. So Jenny, you can talk about that in a little bit about where they find that. But the 3 main ways to do jerky are to soak it in a vinegar solution, and that's going to kill the Salmonella, E. coli. And so we have a recipe for a vinegar marinade, which is very safe procedure to use. We also have another method, which is where you take the meat and you dip it into a hot brine, and that's called a hot pickle cure. So that is another method in which we recommend. And then there is a third method, which I haven't used nearly as much, but you take the meat that you've already dried, dehydrated, and you're going to cook it in the oven at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 minutes to kill those pathogens. So again, it's a vinegar marinade, it's a hot pickle cure, or you're doing additional heating in the oven. And another thing with jerky, a lot of people think it's too salty, but that salt is part of the preservation method of keeping it safe. So don't alter your jerky recipes at all. Use a safe, approved recipe, and you'll have a quality product. And that goes for salsa. That's something else I wanted to talk a little bit about. I get a lot of questions about salsa. If you have a favorite way of making salsa, you want to do it, eat it fresh or freeze it. Otherwise, use a recipe that's approved for canning and follow it exactly. Now, you can make a few changes, but you have to be careful on what those changes are. So, for example, you can use any type of tomato, but you have to use the amount of tomato in the recipe. So if it says 2 cups, don't put in 4 cups to the recipe. A lot of people think the salsas that are canned are too runny, and they are, because you need that heat penetration to get through that product to kill those pathogens. And if you don't, you can have a harmful product. You can change the type of pepper. So if I don't care for real spicy foods, so I may use some sweet bell peppers in with my jalapenos, for example, or tomatillos, but I'm not using really hot peppers. So you can vary the peppers with the heat of the pepper, just not the quantity again. So if it states you need 1 cup of hot pepper, you can use whatever type of pepper. Just make sure it's the same 1 cup quantity. With canning, a lot of the tomato products need an acid added because tomatoes aren't nearly as acidic anymore. We recommend using bottled lemon juice or lime juice or vinegar, and those are at 5% acidity level. A fresh lime or lemon sounds good, but we don't know what the acidity level is, the concentration, so we always recommend bottled for that. I get people that, I just had a question about the spices. They were making pickles. You can delete or add a few spices as desired. So if you don't want the garlic in it, you don't have to put the garlic. If you want a little bit more dill, you can add some more dill, or maybe some other spices, you know, because a lot of people do the pickled beans and the pickled asparagus. So whatever spices you like, you can adjust that somewhat. Thickeners are another thing you cannot do. So people that say their sauce is too thin, I like to recommend can it as a recipe calls for. And if it needs to be thickened, open your jar and add a little bit of cornstarch to it, heat it up, thicken it after you open it up. You don't put the thickener in the product. And, you know, so the salsa is where I find a lot of people want to create their own recipes. There again, in the beginning, I said it's not a time to be creative with canning. You can be creative and freeze it, just don't be creative and can it. And that's about all I have, you guys. Are there any other questions?
Perfect. I don't see any outstanding questions out there, but we'll give folks an opportunity if they have anything else they'd like to ask.
Do you have any other really common things that people ask about, Vicki, on the whole food preservation spectrum?
You know, I'm just trying to think. I did get a question one time. A lot of people don't have time to make their jams and jellies right away, so they will take juice. So for example, maybe they've gone chokecherry hunting and they will take the juice and can the juice and make the jam later. So that is an idea for people, that if you're running into a time crunch, you can the juice. Now, you can't leave it on the counter for 20 years. I did have a question. Someone had found canned chokecherry juice that was 20 years old and they wanted to make jam and jelly or something out of it, which again, we said no, you know, that's way too old. But those are the main things. I get a lot of questions on altitude. They want to make sure they're adjusting for altitude properly. And they might have a question about the pressure dial gauge, because you've got to get your pressure built up to say 12 pounds and you have to keep it there. You can't walk off, leave the kitchen, let the pressure go down to say 8 pounds of pressure. Because if that does happen, you have to start all over with your timing of pressure. And if you overcook, you know what happens. The food's not going to be as palatable. It's usually mushy. And so when people ask me about, you know, jars not sealing and should they recan it, you can, but what will the product be like? You know, if the green beans are mushy after 2 canning sessions, it's not worth it. I'd say put it into the freezer or consume it soon if you can.
Going back to your comment about folks canning juice and making jam later, we've done that with freezing, because oftentimes we get in a situation where we have a bunch of fruit we have to deal with, but we don't have time to go through the whole process. So if we kind of freeze it one way or the other, it will hold and we can make jam later, which is kind of nice.
Yes. Yep. And that is, yeah, and that's one good thing. Or Abby talked about making fruit leather. So she put it in the freezer, she's going to pull it out and make fruit leather. So yeah, if you find that you've got more produce than you can handle, think of the ways you can store it, like the freezer, and then pull it out and do something else with it later. Because like I said, that jam, fruit leather, it'll be wonderful for gifts or just to enjoy yourselves.
So when you're making the jams, it seems like there's a lot of different like types of pectin to choose from. And we tend to use like the lower sugar kind of stuff, which is not real low sugar, but they always emphasize the fact that you need to use exactly the right amount of sugar that they call for in the recipe. And it has something to do with the way that cross gels or something with the sugar interacts with the pectin. Is that correct?
That is correct. So you'll find there's two main types of pectin, a liquid pectin and a powdered pectin. The liquid and powdered pectin are not interchangeable, so that's something to keep in mind. So if your recipe calls for liquid pectin, use liquid pectin. If you only have powdered, you're going to go buy some new liquid pectin. But the liquid pectin is added to the mixture after it boils. The powdered pectin is usually added to the product before it's boiled. And now there are pectins that are either low or no sugar added. So if you have a sugar that you want less sugar, you have to buy those special pectins. They do have instructions on them. I'm working on a booklet with lower salt and lower sugar or no sugar products. So for example, pickles, you either have to use a special recipe to lower the sodium and salt content for pickling. Don't just do it yourself. Same thing with jams and jellies. If you want to use a lower sugar quantity, find the special recipe. And hopefully before the next canning season, I'll have this handout available on our website. In the meantime, you can call us and we can help you find a recipe to meet those needs. Now, if you're doing plain fruit, for example, you can can fruit in just water or a very light syrup. That's okay. But if you're doing jams and jellies and pickles, you've got to be very careful with your recipes.
That sounds like a cool publication. You have a lot of other great publications online that folks could get. I've seen you have some that are even with the wild fruits and stuff. You have recipes and you talk about how to do the different types of wild fruits, which I thought was really neat.
Yeah, we do. We have a lot of people that like to go out and find the wild berries. Some of the wild berries I'm not familiar with because they're not up here in the Northeast area of Wyoming. So that's why I really appreciate the booklet. So if someone calls me, I can research wild berries, for example. And the publications on our website, you can download, you can print, they're no cost. In fact, the Preserving Food in Wyoming, some of us have the booklet. We can send it to you. We got several of those printed out through a grant. So they also make a great gift if you think someone wants to preserve, request a couple copies and share them out.
I often see them in extension offices when I go in different counties. They'll have them displayed and people can just walk in and pick up a copy.
Yes. And like I say, if they don't have it, I put up a slide where we have two other educators in Wyoming. Denise Smith is located in Niobrara County in Lusk. Shelley Balls is in Lincoln County out of Afton. And they will have those books. I also sent a box of the Preserving Food in Wyoming down to Wheatland. They ran out, so I shared some with them. But we're more than willing to help in any way we can. There's only the three of us for the whole state of Wyoming, so there aren't very many of us. And Shelley currently is on maternity leave. So we'll do our best to get back to you to answer questions. Even if you don't have a nutrition and food safety educator in your county office, they can call us from anywhere in the state, and we'll do our best to help everyone out that we can.
Perfect. So Jenny, do you want to run through the, Vicki, again, thank you for being our guest today. Very useful information. Abby or Jenny, do you want to run through the closing remarks?
Well, I
Sure.
was just going to show you a couple of different, those publications we were talking about. And so if you go in the Barnyards and Backyards site and you go under food preservation and safety, we have links there to a whole bunch of different Barnyards and Backyards articles, many of which Vicki has written. And then we also have, I was going to show you those 2 jerky articles she was talking about there. We have one called Making Safe Jerky at Home, and then Hunter's Dilemma, what you do with the extra game meat, is about making jerky as well. But we also have listed down the different websites. And so this one, there's a couple that she showed you on the one slide, but this one goes to the UW Extension webpage where they have all the different information and different publications that you can pull down and use on your own.
And I was just wanted to mention again, I think that Vicki said at one point, check with what your extension office might have as far as borrowing equipment. And so like in our office, we have a food dehydrator that you can come in and use. We have a couple water bath canners. And of course, every office is going to be a little bit different as far as what they lend out or what they have available, what you can use in-house, but that might be a resource or potential for people who just want to get started and try some other things. So definitely check out your local office. And it looks like Jenny's pulled up the map here where all of those offices are. So, well, if there aren't any other questions.
We just have a request to send booklets to an individual, and I will forward that information on to Vicki.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So there, I think someone is going to put the link for our survey in, it's on Facebook, right? And then we'll have the link in the chat on Zoom. And I think when you close Zoom, then the survey will come up, and that just kind of lets us know how the program went or things that we can talk about in the future.
Yep, it should just pop up in your browser. If you could fill it out, we'd greatly appreciate it. Well, thank you, Vicki, for all your great information that you provided today. I'm excited to get started and preserve some food. It's always nice to pull it out in the winter, and it reminds you of our brief summer that we had, at least up here in Laramie. It's really brief.
Yes,
Well,
thank
good
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Have a
Thanks,
good
Vicki.
weekend.